Welcome back, horror fans, cinephiles, and giallo enthusiasts. This is Tanner Leeser, your host for all things giallo here on The King in Giallo. Our next stop on our journey through giallo cinema is the third giallo feature film from Mario Bava, Five Dolls for an August Moon, released in February 1970. In this video, I will do a deep dive overview, which will be spoiler-free. So here is Five Dolls for an August Moon. Overview. Five Dolls for an August Moon is an Italian production directed by the originator of giallo cinema, Mario Bava. The film is written by Mario DiNardo, and the amazing score is composed by Piero Umiliani. The cast consists of Ira Furstenberg as Trudy Farrell, William Berger as Professor Gary Farrell, Teodoro Corra as George Stark, Edwidge Fenech as Marie Cheney, Maurice Pauli as Nick Cheney, Renato Rossini, billed as Howard Ross, as Jack Davidson, Elena Ronea as Peggy Davidson, and Justine Gall as Isabel. The plot follows a group of wealthy industrialists and their wives staying on the private island of one of the men, George Stark. One of the guests, however, is a professor whose latest invention is an industrial resin which will revolutionize the industry and make whoever possesses it even more wealthy. Quickly, it becomes obvious that this whole gathering has been set up so the wealthy businessmen might try to buy off the invention from the professor. The plot thickens after the houseboy is found murdered, and one by one, the other guests are being killed off. Five Dolls for an August Moon was a film which Mario Bava took on because the previously hired director had stepped down. Bava had requested to do rewrites because he hated the script, but he wasn't given a chance because, according to him, they paid me on Saturday and we started shooting on Monday. To this day, some fans of Bava argue whether the film is any good or not, and Bava has even cited it as the worst film he ever made. In typical Hitchcockian fashion, the plot of the film drives forward because of a MacGuffin. In storytelling, specifically in film, a MacGuffin describes an object which is either hardly explained or not at all, but the characters all want it, and this creates instant conflict for the story and drives the plot. The MacGuffin can also be a person, sometimes a place, but is usually an object. A famous example of which I always like to go to is the contents of the briefcase in Pulp Fiction, which are never discussed. As mentioned already, in this film, the new industrial resin is the MacGuffin, of which the ownership of it means distribution rights to other factories across the world. George Stark and the other men who are not the professor are all business associates, and they've planned beforehand that they will try to convince the professor to sell to one of them and divvy up the earnings. But very quickly on, we see that these men are not adverse to trying to secure a secret bargain with the professor one-on-one in the hopes of acquiring it all for themselves, let alone resort to violence to eliminate their immediate competition for the formula. Bava is a master of this type of formulaic thriller plot, the one which is greedy people killing each other off for the hopes of attaining a fortune, and this was already explored in Blood and Blacklace, 1964, and will be explored again later in one of the prime examples of this in the entire genre, Twitch of the Death Nerve, aka Bay of Blood, 1971. The cast is filled with greedy and untrustworthy types who all are quick to commit infidelity and stab each other in the back in typical Bava fashion, guaranteeing their individual demises. But the finale, which I won't spoil if you haven't seen this, certainly does turn this whole setup on its head. In Bay of Blood, the climax is a perfect blast of dramatic irony, but in Five Dolls for an August Moon, the climax is more akin to yet another Bava film, one which will take the same concept and perfect it, in my opinion. The 1974 crime thriller noir, Rabid Dogs, which, by the way, is my favorite Mario Bava film. I could talk at length about that movie, and I think the ending is one of the most inspiring payoffs for me when I think of writing and directing. Despite hating the script he was given, Bava endeavored to heighten the style of the film, which is evident in not only the heavy use of zooms and focus racks, which are practically a given in many Bava flicks, but also the gorgeous decor of the mansion and the style of its characters, and lastly, the usage of the island's setting and the amount of time he films characters running about the island, which works to both emphasize the size of the place, yet establish how futile it all is in the end, because they are still surrounded by ocean, and thus it is all one giant enclosure. Another Bava trope for this time is the hyper-stylized murder set pieces. This is established in Blood and Blacklace, which influenced Argento's The Bird with the Crystal Plumage, and here we have a return to form for Bava with one key difference. We don't see the murders happen. Everything is off camera, and while some may argue this is likely because Bava hated the project to begin with, I'd say this is one of the only films where I let this type of thing slide. This is perhaps the most acceptable usage of off-camera slangs for the reasons that, 1, we have no way of guessing who it might be, which arguably could have been inferred by the size and movements of the killer if you were to see them. 2, we are discovering the deaths as everybody else discovers them, which means we do not ever have a one-up over the other characters. And finally, 3, people who go missing may or may not be dead, and we do not ever know definitively until the plot wants us to know. Some could say it is cheap, I understand, but I think it works in the film's favor personally. Despite all this, the film does have a high body count, and the more logical explanation for this lack of violence might frankly be the rushed nature of the project and the film's low budget. Bava shows that if you do not show the kills, then you can still dazzle and amaze with the reveals of the bodies, which are honestly pretty elaborate. The first death has a man dead on the beach with blood staining his white shirt and surrounded by crabs. Another has a character taking a moment outside after lovemaking, who is then discovered the next moment to have a gunshot wound in the head. Another is found in her bra and panties, tied to a tree with her arms bound over her head and a knife in her chest, mirroring a moment from the opening scene of the film. And another has a body found in a bathtub with crimson staining the water from the poor victim's wrists. The visuals, again, are less grotesque and more oddly gorgeous in their presentation, something which will become emblematic of the genre at large. My favorite aspect about the movie is the recurring preservation of the discovered bodies in cellophane, and then the staging of them one by one in the deep freezer for later inspection by forensics, something which starts out as a bit tragic, I guess, but by the third and fourth times becomes a running joke, and by the final time it is so ridiculous, especially because it uses the same song every time. I love it, and it is my favorite part about the movie. The plot does have its holes, and things are not always adequately explained or responsibly set up, but all the flaws of the script and the story are pushed aside as Bava does what he does best, which is showcase style and technique and entertain. One major point of confusion in the movie, which would usually hurt a film like this, is the character of Isabel, who is not a part of the gathering and seems to just wander around aimlessly, spying on the interactions of the other house guests. She behaves a bit childishly and evokes a sense of innocence and wonderment at the surroundings, the things, and the people about her. The explanation behind her presence is weakly hinted at in a single sentence, which could just have easily have been cut, in which we learn her parents are still away, and thus we are just left to assume that she is under the supervision or in the care of the Starks until her parents return from wherever that is. $5 for an August Moon is regarded as the strangest giallo in the canon of Bava's films, and was interestingly released in the same month as The Bird with the Crystal Plumage, but before that movie had started to steamroll within its own success. The title of the picture invites speculation, and admittedly is more poetic than it is logical, more nonsensical than it is thought-provoking. Are the $5 the 5 women of the cast? Are they the 5 bodies wrapped in plastic and left in cold storage? We aren't told, and it doesn't really matter. The film came out when flashy titles were just the way to name your giallo movie. William Berger appeared in The Murder Clinic, 1966. Teodoro Corra would later appear in Bava's Roy Colt and Winchester Jack, 1970. Corra was not just an actor, but also a production manager, arguably more well known for that, and some of his credits in that capacity include the giallo The Blood-Stained Shadow, 1978 by Antonio Bido, and Body Puzzle, 1992 by Lamberto Bava. Edwidge Fenech returns to the genre for her second outing here, debuting in giallo films with the forgotten and trashy Top Sensation, 1969, but would become one of the top-billed women associated with the genre, with later entries as The Strange Vice of Mrs. Ward, 1971 by Sergio Martino, and Strip Nude for Your Killer, 1975. Maurice Poli would go on to appear in Bava's Rabid Dogs, again, favorite Bava film. Ira Furstenberg, who rose to prominence by marrying into royalty at the age of 15, has a fairly modest acting resume, later appearing in the giallo film The Fifth Chord by Luigi Bazzani. One final bit of trivia: Bava edited this film also. While he was often involved in the post-production of a lot of his films, he was never officially credited as the editor before or after this. Perhaps this was out of necessity for this film's production, given how rushed and low budget it was. Bava would go on to fondly remember the editing process. Perhaps this was his favorite aspect of working on this film. I often point out Bava's usage of stylistic methods to transition from one scene to another. Oftentimes, it is a dissolve or a focus rack. Here, the focus racks are aplenty and work in the film's favor to evoke a somewhat dreamlike effect which disorients the viewer. This method is most effective at the climax of a certain scene in the third act, where three of the survivors have agreed to stay together so as to prevent the true killer, whoever it might be, from being able to operate with efficiency, only for them all to pass out after sharing a cocktail. Fun fact, the film was shot in just 19 days. And that's $5 for an August moon. Please like this video, share it with your friends if they are horror fans or cinephiles. Subscribe to The King in Giallo if you haven't yet, and if you have any questions, thoughts, curiosities, or concerns, leave those below in the comment section and I will get back to you. Give The King in Giallo a follow on Instagram and a like on Facebook. Next time on The King in Giallo will be the review and gialli tally for $5 for an August moon. Thank you very much for your continued support. This is Tanner Leeser for The King in Giallo, and if nothing else, I'll see you next time.
C'è di tutto, di tutto!
Pianti, idiota! Zitta! E basta! Il primo tentativo di cameriere sul gelato.